Brian Turner, the director of the Religion Committee, which is a small research group funded by Mellon Foundation. We've been going for 3 years now. Every year we choose a particular topic and we work on it for the whole year. And the topic for this year was catastrophe, because there seems so much talk about catastrophe around natural catastrophe, social, political, environmental, and so on and so forth. And broadly speaking, we've looked at 3 issues: apocalypse, or the apocalyptic sort of tradition, in which there's a truth that's revealed as a consequence of catastrophe. The modern notion of catastrophe itself, which, as you know, grew out of Greek tragic drama structure. And catastrophes also can promise to sort of have a post-catastrophic situation. And then crisis is a word that comes out of medical history, meaning a sort of crisis or turning point in a human being's health, which can also be a turning point towards renewed health, renewal, and so on and so forth. And this is our final conference or seminar today. And I mean, quite clearly, news about the Catholic Church has been globally present in terms of a variety of crises about sex scandals, the lack of transparency about that, the decline in recruitment of the priesthood, conflicts over women in the church, and so on and so forth. And so we thought it would be interesting to have a debate amongst people from very different backgrounds and from very different viewpoints about whether the Catholic Church is in terminal decline, or whether this is a crisis which is also a turning point leading to a new beginning and a restructuring. And so I won't go through their very long and distinguished careers, but we're very pleased to have this panel of speakers this morning. Anthea Butler is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies and Graduate Chair at the University of Pennsylvania, published Women in the Church of God in Christ, and has a book coming out on Sarah Palin and the Tea Party soon. Michael Brendan Doughty is contributing editor at the American Conservative. His work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, ESPN Magazine, Slate, and many other publications. Massimo Fagioli worked on the John the 23rd Foundation for Religious Studies in Bologna, and has written on reform and liturgy and ecclesiology. And last but not least, our moderator for today, Marion Ronan, is Research Professor of Catholic Studies at New York Theological Seminary, and is the author of 4 books, including Tracing the Sign of the Cross. So without more ado, and perhaps this is a good, and because I'm going to have to, I apologize, I'm going to have to leave early today, but just to thank Lydia Wilson for organizing this conference and getting you all together, and for being a stalwart member of the committee. So
the title is very inviting in terms of crisis or catastrophe. I'm inclined, and I will explain why in these next few minutes, to see the actual moment for the Catholic Church in terms of apocalypses, actually. So that is my perception of the situation, in light especially of what happened in these last 2-3 months. So the resignation of Pope Benedict, whose real reasons we don't know yet, nobody knows, it's, I think, a sign of this lifting the veil on a situation that has to do with scandals, has to do with the impossibility of governing the Catholic Church in a transparent way, the impossibility at some point of reforming Catholicism. So I think that the resignation is a sign not just of crisis, but of a moment of final reckoning, of final judgment. And this resignation is the acknowledgement that it is impossible, in a nutshell, to govern Catholicism from a theological point of view, as a theologian. That's my impression. But as an historian, I like to look at things in an historical way. So if we think about the most important crisis of Catholicism in modernity, I would identify four of them. The first one, and the real beginning of the challenges for Catholicism in modernity, is of course the French Revolution. That is the biggest possible incident that for Catholicism happened in history. And then the long 19th century, the age of liberalism, and basically the issue of democracy and of pluralism. The second crisis is the crisis of 1907, the anti-modernist purge, the biggest crisis in the theological elite of Catholicism, so hundreds of theologians being purged and excommunicated in some cases. The third crisis is the crisis that begins with World War II and goes up to the early 50s. So the condemnation of theologians, the impossibility of Catholicism of making a moral judgment of the World War II, the Holocaust. It is a judgment that happened only in the mid-60s, not before that. And that was a sign of the inability to articulate a moral judgment, a political judgment on what was happening between the late 30s and 1950 with the encyclical Humani Generis. And the fourth crisis begins with 1968. So I am a specialist of the Second Vatican Council, 1962-1965, which is, if you want, the longest period, or the last period of honeymoon between Catholicism and the public opinion. And then 1968 comes, and it's much more about the encyclical on contraception than on students in Berkeley. And after 1968, something changes radically, something changes forever. And there is a bifurcation, a separation between the authority of the church and the authority of theologians, between what the church teaches and the social behavior, the moral behavior of Catholics especially. And I think that we are still living in the consequences of 1968. So I think that the actual moment in the Catholic Church should be, or can be, seen under three different types of issues, of crises in this apocalypse, if you want. The first aspect has to do with scandals. And I don't have to give you the list, because every day just open the newspaper, and we just heard this morning about the cardinal from Scotland who has been officially sent away from Scotland for a period of penance, and so it's a day-by-day thing. So the scandals, we have the clerical abuse scandal, the financial mismanagement, the issues with sexuality, homosexuality, which is an issue basically of hypocrisy, where many of the people who teach these things, they don't even believe what they teach, and they pretend that Catholics still believe these things and they still practice these things. There's a massive amount of hypocrisy out there that has to do, I think, and here I speak also from my experience of a European Catholic coming to the US. There are a few things that stand out. This focus, or this, I would say sometimes, obsession of making of Catholicism a family thing, which is focused on family values, family thing. I was walking here and I saw this ad for this TV series, I guess, Real Housewives of New Jersey, and it said, family is a force of nature. which is exactly the problem. As Catholics, we should focus on grace, not on nature. So, but making our family the focus of everything is a distortion, I think, and it's a very American Catholic spin of Catholicism, let's say. And so there are scandals, and they are not a product of these last few years, but in the last few years we have learned more about them, and I think that this is a good sign. It is not a bad sign that we know more about them. The second part of this crisis is what I would call the problem of being a marginal church, which means having fewer priests, fewer nuns, fewer friars, a radical decline in the numbers of members of the religious orders. We have the problem that is especially visible in the United States of the closing of Catholic schools, the relevance of Christian morality in the public sphere. So we have a church that perceives itself clearly as more marginal than 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago, not to speak about 1 century ago. I think that if this has critical issues, I think that this is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that being a more marginal church could allow Catholics to think about power, about society, about influence, about in a more marginal way. I think that Catholicism had become too acquainted, too familiar with power, with influence. I see Catholicism historically, but also essentially, as the anti-empire. I mean, I think that one of the magics of Catholicism is that it offers an alternative to the empire, whether it's Henry the Fourth, whether it's empire under the various labels, the financial system, everything. So I think that being more marginal offers Catholics more reasons to understand what is being a Christian about. And I think that being marginal is a great opportunity to escape this illusion that there is one brave new world that we're going to be forced to accept. That is, I think it is a crisis, but it is providential if you accept this theological term. And then there is the third kind of issues, that is what I would call the open issues. There are issues on which the Catholic Church is now perceiving, feeling on its skin that there are things that need to be rediscussed in a collegial way, in a formal way, whether a council, a synod, but in a more collegial way, and they have to do with body, sexuality, with the substitution that we have made in these last few decades. We have substituted salvation with health. In Latin, salus means both salvation and health. We have completely, and in this Catholicism has not been perceptive, that in our public discourse, especially in the Western world, we have substituted, and we talk much more about health, about spiritual health, about bodily health, about psychological health, and much less about salvation. I think that what Ivan Illich said 40 years ago, more or less, about the medical nemesis, that we are all going to be patients. It's something that is still interrogating the Catholic Church. Another open issue, and these issues are open because in these last 50 years, there has been no moment for the Catholic Church for a collegial open discussion on them. At Vatican II, so 50 years ago, these issues, so body, sexuality, health, the second issue, which has to do with women and gender in the church, gender and roles, gender and power, these issues, they were never on the table of the Second Vatican Council, and not because they were subtracted or withdrawn. In 1962, for the Catholic Church, they were not issues on the table. Another of the open issues that is the biggest one probably is how to be faithful to the universal claim that Catholicism has, how to reconcile that with a democracy and with pluralistic democracy. This is especially visible in the Western world, especially in the United States. And the fourth of these open issues is how to re-understand Catholicism as one holy Catholic Church, a universal church in a world and in a church that is now globalized as it has never been, which means that now every Sunday many more Asians go to Mass than Europeans. That has huge consequences. So there are, for Catholics in each continent, different issues that are going to be more visible. And in this, Catholicism has huge problems in building a magisterium, a teaching, a set of ideas that are consistent, but that are that say something to Catholics in different continents. To conclude, I think that there are many signs. I think that in light of what happened in these last 3 months, I think that, and I say that with all due respect, I think that these last 8 years with Pope Benedict, they were the most difficult years in a very long time. So I think that with Pope Benedict, we have seen, and we can get deeper into this in the debate, we have seen the lowest point in the mutual understanding between Catholicism and the world, for many reasons. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why he resigned. I think that this situation is going to be different, but there will always be signs of crisis and of contradiction between what Catholicism is and what modernity wants Catholicism to be. There will always be a difference. One last thing is this. I think that one of the biggest crises, and I see that especially as a European, as an Italian, one of the biggest crises that we see that put the Catholic Church and Western society, Western political system especially, in the same boat, is that what's happening is basically a huge fight against one special kind of leadership in the Western world. You can call them bishops or cardinals or priests, or you can call them representatives, senators, the political elite. What is going on is a huge fight against an old kind of leadership. I've studied bishops all my life, almost, and I've seen that until a few decades ago, the authority of the leadership of the bishops, of the cardinals of the Pope, went unquestioned on everything. It was unquestioned because it was unquestionable. Now it's going to be questioned. It is questioned, thank God, and I think it's a good thing. But it is a fight that put Catholicism with the same range of issues and of problems that now political systems in Europe and in North America, they have to fight against. You can call it populism, or you can call it Tea Party or whatever, but it's this idea that we are going to reclaim authority that for centuries had been given to the elites, to the political elites, social elites, and religious elites. This age is over, and to see what Catholicism is going through in this I think, is a very useful way to understand what's going on in the social system, in the political system, in the Western world. So this is my view in a few minutes about this thing: Catholicism, crisis, or catastrophe. Thank you.
I want to thank Lydia for the invitation to come, because usually I'm just in my pajamas writing about these things for Religion Dispatches, and I don't get to talk about them very much except between February and March of this year when we found ourselves with the Pope that resigned. But I want to start off by making an analogy here. Crisis or catastrophe? Maybe it's neither. Maybe it's really a Dan Brown novel. And the reason why I say that is because we have two popes right now. One is living within Vatican City. The other one doesn't want to live in the papal apartments, and he's in an apartment with everyone else. We have a situation in our country right now where we have thousands of Catholic schools being closed. We have a cardinal in Scotland who's been sent off for repentance. Every day we have more and more scandals in the church. And it actually does sound a little bit like a Dan Brown novel. There seems to be a problem that we need to solve. We can't quite figure out what that problem is, and there's no amount of symbology that is going to get us out of this problem. Because the problem is very simple. The problem is that the church, from its inception, has always been too unwieldy for its own good. And perhaps that's the whole problem to begin with. I thought about the first time I went to Rome, and I saw St. Peter's in front of me, and I thought, they just put all this stuff on top of Rome. This is still Rome. And it's true in a lot of ways. But what I want to talk about today is probably going to be a little surprising to everybody, because I'm going to come at this from a very different perspective, but a lot of what I'm going to say will link up to what Massimo has to say. And I want to talk about three very big problems facing the church today. And I think it's actually worse than the catastrophe. I think basically, in the words of Scripture, unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, therefore won't bring much fruit, this thing is dead. And whatever the new thing is going to be about the Catholic Church has to come out of people and a sense in which the old hierarchies have to die. There are three very big problems right now facing the church. First are the structural and financial issues. The second, demographics, competition, and tension, and I'll put those together and you'll see why in a minute. And then messaging and morality is the third. But first, let me talk about the structural and financial issues. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania, and we've had a very interesting time since I've arrived there in 2009 with the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, in which we are faced with a very big crisis. Over 40 schools have closed. We are the first in the nation to have convicted a Monsignor, an administrator, a high-level official for malfeasance and moving priests around. And we have a number of churches, probably maybe close to over 100, that will have to be closed. In addition to that, we had a diocesan financial officer who was convicted of embezzling almost $1 million by going to Borgata Casino and other places on the diocesan credit card and having a really good time, okay? Now, that is a small microcosm of what is happening in dioceses across the nation and the world today. This is just a small part of the story. In an interesting piece that was in The Economist back at the end of August, I believe, last year, they claim that the sexual abuse cases have cost the American church alone more than $3 billion. $3 billion. And we're not done yet because there's still another round to go. Now, think about this for a minute. The church has paid out the average of $1 million per person who has been abused. And if statutes of limitations are changed right now, the church is fighting this in Pennsylvania so that the statutes won't be lifted for a year as they were in California, which made California the largest payouts in the country. You begin to see the scope of the problem. There is a huge financial issue happening. And the finances of the church are run by the princes of the church who don't understand finances. So we have a problem. We have a corporation that is in crisis. This corporation has lost 20% of its revenue in the last year because of malfeasance, because of people leaving, because of the fact that people like my father who say, I won't give another dime, nor will I leave a dime to the church. Between 2000 and 2013, 2,090 U.S. Catholic schools closed or consolidated, and the enrollment fell 24.5%. That was another source of revenue. It's also a source of training up people in the Catholic faith. These are now gone. When you begin to think about the amounts of money that have been for payouts, the amount of physical plant that sits empty in not just America, but around the world, and unlike Europe, as you know, in Europe, at least you can charge a fee for people like me who go on tourists and want to look at all the churches, right? We don't do that here. They just sit empty or they close, as they are in Boston, with people protesting in front of them because their parishes have closed. Okay? So we have a number of we have big physical plant issues. You have amounts of money that have been paid out. You have insurance issues. Most dioceses have burned through their insurance. How do you reinsure clergy again? Okay, this is the next big issue that is going to come to the forefront. Pension plans have been raided to pay out people. Money has been moved. All of these things create a huge structural issue for not just the American church, but the church around the world. Consider the fact that 60% of what the Catholic Church needs to run around the world comes from America. And when you begin to put that together with the fact that the rest of the world won't be able to put in that same kind of money if the Catholic Church really fails here in America, we've got a terrible problem. It's worse than what people actually think it is. So that's the first thing, to think about structural and financial issues. Another piece of the structural issue is how do you find people to continue to work in these venues, whether they're clergy or not. I didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about hierarchical issues, but hierarchical issues are part of the structural issues, because if you don't have places to train clergy members, we've had problems when I was in Los Angeles, they were talking about closing Camarillo up for a little while because they were trying to figure out how they were going to sell that so that they could pay off some of the claims in the LA Archdiocese, but they couldn't do that because of a trust that was set up. So that that was a big issue that couldn't be resolved. When you begin to think about you don't have enough staff to run the churches, you will not have women coming in to become nuns. You don't allow lay people to do the same kinds of tasks. Then you have the structural issues that the buildings are not filled, you don't have the money to run them, and you don't have the people to run. So whether it's a financial resource issue or a human resource issue, the church, especially in America, its problems are sifting out to the rest of the world. So that's the first piece of this. The second part is demography, competition, and tension. Demography is changing. What was happening is that you have an older church, and that older church with people who are willing to still remain in that church are dying off. And that's the first piece. In America, that is the case. You don't have the same kind of uptick. You do have people coming into the church, but not the same kind of uptick that you've had before. So that is one piece of a problem. The shift from the, I will call North American, European kind of context to Latin America, Africa, and Asia context means profoundly different things. First of all of these places right now are contending with Pentecostalism and neo-charismatic churches. I'll tell you a story just very briefly. One of the big bishops in the Universal Life Church in Brazil had over, I believe it was maybe 3 weeks ago, over 25,000 people in line waiting to get a book signed by him. Okay. Now, Pope Francis will probably get the same numbers, or quite more, when he comes to Brazil to visit in the next few months. But the difference here is this. While Catholics are preaching a message of poverty, Pentecostals are preaching a message of power and prosperity. And those two things don't mix. And if you are in a world that has moved towards a capitalistic world where someone is telling you if you'll just receive Jesus Christ and you'll just believe for your healing and your wealth, as opposed to Pope Francis, who's saying we need to have, this option for the poor, who do you think that younger people are going to go to in part of this world? If you don't have any money, you're going towards the people who are going to say, I can have power and I can have prosperity. And that's the difference between the modern world and the church right now. That is a big issue. And this is why Pentecostalism is booming in places like Latin America and Africa. Where the church has tried to do dialogues with Pentecostals, it has been met in the ecumenical world with great fanfare. But in the outside world, these things turn out to be families that are broken because half of the family has decided to go into a neo-charismatic or Pentecostal church, half of the family has decided to stay Catholic. And so where the church has failed is it's not been able to deal with how to talk to the people who are losing family members to these new movements. When you have movements in charismatic figures and you have other figures within the Catholic Church, would be the bishops, priests, cardinals, who are not as charismatic, perhaps, as the rest of these figures, then there becomes a problem of competition and tension and sheep stealing, as the evangelicals will call it, okay? And so when you look at that and what's happening on the ground in places like Latin America and Africa, you begin to have a deeper problem. The other piece right now, especially what nobody will talk about, and it's not been in the news very much, are places like Nigeria, where the Catholic Church is not just competing against Pentecostals, but it's also brushing against the Muslim world. And that has been an even bigger problem because it becomes a problem of violence. And so these kinds of tensions on the ground make for a very difficult situation. The third place we have is messaging and morality. And this is where I'll use a very recent example to talk about a little bit. The Leadership Council of Women Religious was just in Rome. And if you noticed last week, there was a classic news piece about doublespeak. One bishop had come to speak to the women religious and said, I had no idea that this thing was coming out, and we would have worked together with all of that, and we would have helped you. And then the Vatican all of a sudden turned around and said, oh, no, we're on one accord with all of this, and this is okay. So those of you who are Catholic are probably sitting out here thinking, well, what does that mean? It means what all of us who are Catholic know all the time, which is there's always going to be doublespeak and cleanup, and what you hear and what really happens are quite two different things. And so this messaging that has come out of the Vatican in the last few years has been troublesome at best. I would have to agree with you when you say Benedict has been the worst thing that happens, but I want to put it one step further. I want to say that those problems that Pope Benedict had were problems that began with Pope John Paul II, the most charismatic pope of all, who did a lot of things underground that people don't want to pay attention to. And if he gets canonized for sainthood, he's going to be one saint I will never pray to. And I will put that out here right now, because the things that happened in the church that did not get dealt with or were squelched underneath Pope John Paul II absolutely created the problems that we have today. They absolutely have created them. When you allow a major figure of a religious order to continue on in the kinds of perfidy that was happening with, and I'm forgetting their name right now.
Maciel.
Yeah, Maciel, yes. The Legion of Christ. This was just horrific. And so these things that went unchecked have now, in the words of Malcolm X, are the chickens coming home to roost. Except there's a big giant vulture sitting on top of St. Peter's. So what happens? But let me talk about one more thing here about messaging, because especially in America right now, we've got a problem with messaging. It is very difficult for someone like me to watch the Conference of Catholic Bishops here in America go for a second round of Fortnight for Freedom. What has happened, and I think a lot of the press has missed this story, is a wholesale melding of the Conference of Catholic Bishops with religious right concerns. In the past, these things have been, the allegiance was only on abortion, perhaps. That was the biggest piece of the allegiance. The rest of it, we could go back and forth so much. But what has happened since 2008 has been completely overboard. And I will say completely overboard in the sense in which now religious freedom has been taken and used a different kind of way by the Conference of Catholic Bishops. Bishop Laurie, who's announced this second fortnight for freedom. Most Catholics don't even know what a fortnight is. How are you going to say it's about freedom if nobody knows what the fortnight means, except they go, oh, maybe it's 2 weeks. I don't know. He's putting this right at the end when everybody's going on a vacation and they're not in their parishes anyway. So there you go. This wholesale locked into the Republican Party line has gutted the Catholic bishops' witness in this country. And that has been the worst thing, I believe, that has happened to the conference in a long time. The sex abuse scandal was hard enough, but to watch them march in and take away all the things that they thought about what healthcare should be, even though we have Catholic hospitals and everything else, to watch Bishop Laurie sit and talk about kosher versus non-kosher at the meeting that a couple back in, what was this, 2012, 2013? Yeah. About 2011, about birth control and the healthcare mandate. And to see all of this roll out signifies to me that there is a great disjunction between what the bishops see is happening in the parishes every day and their aspirations to be on the political stage in America. And this piece is just a small microcosm of the empire syndrome that we have coming out of the Vatican right now. By aligning themselves with this political system, they have killed their possible witness for anything else. So that when you hear people in the pew say, and I'm going to quote a piece recently written by Bob Orsi, where he talks about a woman who he interviewed about sex scandals, and she said, "You goddamn well better get this story right." And I thought that's the perfect line, because the bishops haven't gotten this story right. They haven't been able to really come at this in a different way. In certain places in the nation, it's happened very well. In other places, it's not. But as a whole, the Conference of Catholic Bishops are more noted right now for their political stances rather than their moral stances. And those political stances have outweighed their moral stances. And so when you have this disjunctive messaging going on, how can it possibly be that the Catholic Church will be able to be the kind of salt and light that it wants to be? How can it speak into the issues of today with timeless truths, as it were, that mean something to people that will draw them back to the whole reason why they're supposed to be a church in the first place? So while I think that there might be some room for help, I think that that room for help will only come with the people who, like myself, call themselves dissenters, or the people who have decided to stay and want to try to work it out. I don't think that we can see in this present generation a lot of hope. I like Pope Francis's words a lot, but basically right now, there's no way at the age of 78 that he will be able to undertake a massive overhaul of the church. The kinds of administrative things that need to be done in order to get things working back, and more of I would say go back to even an early church kind of way where bishops take much more responsibility than they might have or could have in certain kinds of ways. That would need to happen. But also what needs to happen is a change in how the Catholic Church presents itself. Right now, it is a tainted and tarnished organization. It's very difficult to give your child over to an organization that has been more for the pedophiles and the abusers than it has been for its own people. How do you give your children over to a church to get catechized when you're not quite sure what might happen to them, even though rules have changed and laws have changed? How can you do that? How can you do that when a bishop in Kansas has been convicted and cited for not reporting about an abusive priest in his diocese according to the child laws that are in place? There's a problem, and the problem is one of trust. The church and its people have broken trust. What the church represents, that trust has been broken. And so until the church figures out, and I say this is church universal, figures out how it is going to repackage what the core truth is and that message of redemption in Jesus Christ, it will not be able to move forward. It will not be able to stand. And until we get through another 20 to 30 years of the cleanup process that is going to happen with closures of more churches, more schools, less priests, more money paid out, less insured dioceses, then that might be the place where the smaller church and the smaller, universal Catholic Church that you talk about, that might be the salvation. But that's only going to come 30 years out. One more thing. In 5 years, it will be the 500th anniversary of the 95 Theses being nailed up on the Wittenberg door by Martin Luther. This might be a good time in the next 5 years for somebody to come up with another 95 Theses and nail them up on somebody's front door so that the Catholic Church can see it. I am a pessimist. I think there's going to be a schism. I just do. I don't know if it's now or later, but I think there will be a schism. And I think that schism will happen in part because of the structural failures and the messaging failures of the church that have occurred. I hope that's wrong. I hope I'm not right. But let's see what happens in 2017. Thank you.
I want to thank Lydia Wilson first and everyone who helped organize this, and I want to ask for your sympathy. I'm not an academic, I'm a journalist. I'm of Irish blood, so my elbows are a bit sharp, and because I have a lot I want to say, I'm going to be drawing in very broad strokes, and I'll miss certain shades of meaning that maybe we could get into later. I'm going to say some things that will very much upset some liberal sensibilities, and then I'm going to come around and say things that conservatives would like to pillory me for. So if you feel yourself being beat up, just wait until I start on the other guys. What are commonly called the crises in the Catholic Church right now, the priest abuse scandal, scandal of cover-up, even worse, the Catholic laundries, and a number of other political contrumps, seem to me signs of a deeper interlocking set of crises, a crisis of faith, a crisis of the priesthood, and one of liturgy too. Can the church be reformed? One way to answer as a Catholic is just to say no. On the one hand, the church is made up of sinners, very few of whom ever reform themselves, fewer still who become saints. And in every age, priests betray their vows and the gospel. Some have illicit abusive sex, others abuse their religious power. Pope John the 12th was known for raping pilgrims to Rome. I mean, that was his reputation. We have not actually suffered that much in this age. And on the other hand, theologically speaking, and this is the mystery of the church is already the spotless bride of Christ, and the invitations to this outrageous wedding party and reception are already out the door. But of course, in the meantime, we have to reform the Catholic Church, if we mean by putting it back into something a good, a true, and beautiful form. And today the question of reform is often asked as if the word reform were synonymous with becoming another mainline Protestant church in the West. You may be familiar with these ecclesial communities. If not, they're these churches where older, whiter people are mercifully kept safe from ever hearing the gospel. And my sense is that they go there to acknowledge their support for progressive causes and to celebrate how not fundamentalist they are. And these churches are dying because casserole potlucks and a vague wish for more conservative political defeats can be had without the Book of Common Prayer sitting there in the corner kind of mocking your modern English. Something like this attempt at reform, in fact something much more sophisticated than it, was tried in the Catholic Church. And tracing its roots would take us back to the late 19th century, but I'll fast forward to the part where the disaster became obvious. The religious enthusiasm of the Second Vatican Council resulted in a situation in 1971, say, where priests were being told that they were the vanguard of a new Pentecost. And think of that imagery for a moment. The 1960s constituted a second founding of the church. These priests were instructed in an often opaque and sometimes outrageously anti-sacerdotal theology of Karl Rahner, Schillebeeckx, and others. Some of this work was younger than the Nixon administration by the time it made it to seminary syllabus. Many were told to abandon things like the rosary or even regular confession, and that wasn't all that was changed, obviously. Vatican II's document on the liturgy mandated revised statutes governing, quote, the shape and construction of altars, the nobility, placing, and safety of the Eucharistic tabernacle, the dignity and suitability of the baptistry, the proper ordering of sacred images, embellishments, and vestments, to bring them into line with an as yet unwritten new liturgy. Confessionals were ripped out of churches, sometimes scrapped, sometimes burned. And so nearly all the material elements of the central act of Catholic worship were tossed out or reshaped in a revolutionary spasm that I think will eventually be recognized for what it was, the greatest and most destructive wave of iconoclasm in the history of Christendom. Worse than anything in the East, worse than the Protestant Reformation because it touched more churches and more lives. And I know that is causing people's hair to stand on their neck.
Yo, just laughing. Go ahead.
The new liturgy was imposed on the faithful in a kind of blitzkrieg. Think of how many years it took recently to change the words for all to for many in the modern Mass. It took several years. But in the 1960s, the liturgy of the church was completely rewritten and instituted in some parishes in a matter of weeks or a weekend. The theology changed too. The propitiatory sacrifice of the Mass, that ascent from from Holy Thursday to Good Friday, to reconcile sinners to God, to appease God's wrath, was inverted to become primarily a memorial meal, symbolizing the as yet unrealized spiritual unity and inherent worth of humanity. So when the theology changes, when all the physical elements and the rationalizations behind the central act of worship change, even a failing college-level student of religious study would put two to two together and say that these changes constituted an attempt, conscious or not, to impose a new religion on the Catholic Church, one that was not sacerdotal, or if it was only in the Protestant sense, one that partially denied the reality of original sin and hoped to achieve the union of all Christian churches. This attempt petered out almost immediately in the intellectual life of the Church. It has almost no heirs. And it's funny enough, it seems so unthinkable that it even happened, looking back on it. For Karl Rahner, it just seems too bold for a German theologian in the 1960s to make the qualified assertion, so optimistic, that divine grace, as he put it, can be considered as something belonging to man's existence. A German theologian saying this within 20-something years of the Holocaust, of all the other totalitarian crimes and enormities of the 20th century, one would think that our theologians would have a darker religious imagination after that, more circumspect, more conscious of human sin and evil. But of course the opposite occurred. But the church these revolutionaries promised never actually came into existence. And the one that they left behind was immediately in ruins. 2/3 of U.S. seminaries operating in 1965 had closed by 2002. During the same years, those numbers of seminarians dropped from 49,000 to 4,700, a decline of more than 90%. In Europe, the decline is just as dramatic, and sometimes in Ireland, even faster. Now, this failure to impose this new religion is partly due to the half-thought-out opposition of Pope John Paul and other popes, and then maybe the stubbornness of the pew-sitters. But I think its mortal weakness was that it was too subtle because it tried to remain stealthy. It tried to express itself in all the old terms, theological terms of Catholicism, while replacing the substance. So the priesthood was left in a state where congregations still held on to something like the old faith, or something close to it with a few things revised. Theologians gave them reasons to doubt this faith. And so the priesthood has been reduced to a set of religious functionaries. And what do religious functionaries do? They become vassals of existing cultural and societal powers. Now, it's no surprise that this loss of faith, I think, is accompanied by a rise, or a hint of a rise, of the heresy of Gallicanism. We all of a sudden have these national bishops' conferences that issue opinions on topics of all interest. It's a way of exercising their apostolic authority in the church, but not really. They act like a kind of think tank or lobbying group. And this reduction of the faith to almost an ideology has had far more devastating and distorting effects with so-called conservative Catholics, who now adopt their faith as if it were just another political ideology. The church is conceived of as a party, and the world as a competing party, locked in a kind of eternal battle. And this comes with an unarticulated but very disturbing reconception of the papacy, or the Pope himself, as party leader, as dear leader. His judgments must be considered wise, no matter if they contradict the judgments of the previous party leader. And you can see this error when laymen neglect to even learn the basics of the faith, but pour themselves into the latest encyclical from Rome. This is kind of unprecedented in Catholic history. Most lay Catholics would never hear of an encyclical from Rome. But now these so-called Catholic intellectuals pour themselves into them. And this, how do I put it? You also see this tendency in Catholic journalism where clever rationalizations are abound for anything a pope says or does. Rationalizations totally disconnected and unannounced by the Pope himself. They come out of nowhere. And this servility is how popes whose reign on the throne of Peter has been obviously disastrous for the Church, like John Paul II's, Pope Paul's, are suddenly causes for canonization now. Their reigns were utterly disastrous, whatever their personal piety. How can the universal Church raise them to the altars and say that they fulfilled the task that they were asked to discharge? And this servility, you see it's how, by reducing the Church to a party or an ideology, this is how bishops excuse their priests, how priests excuse the behavior of their bishops, how the laity excuse themselves. Because in party politics, scandal is worse than crime. Appearance is more important than reality, and so we live today in the Catholic Church in America with an utterly insipid translation of the Bible, barely English, a mediocre liturgy, a rotting priesthood, and a stinking episcopacy. And people still call it a springtime in the life of the Church. The attempts at imposing some order and reforming the Church have lacked any vigor. Even Pope Francis, who has somehow chosen to solve the problem of the Vatican bureaucracy and the Curia by forming a second advisory group of cardinals, another layer of bureaucracy, perhaps. He has not done anything to the former. We wait to see if he wishes to reform the Curia. My sources in Rome told me that his election was chosen precisely because he has one lung and is 78 years old. It is no threat. Before him, Pope Benedict made an attempt, and I have much more positive feelings about him and much worse ones about John Paul II. He made an attempt to liberate the old Catholic liturgy, which was unambiguously Catholic in its theology and ritual, but his ability to reform the everyday modern liturgy was decidedly weak, and it was half-hearted. He tried to impose a meaning on the Second Vatican Council, which he describes as having only just been discovered. He calls this intellectual exercise the hermeneutic of continuity. And this hermeneutic of continuity inverts the history of that council and pretends that it should have been the modernizing clauses and phrases in those documents that were ignored, and that the council's dictates were implemented by conservative or traditionalists instead of by more liberals and progressives. This hermeneutic idea is both insufficient to account for the past 50 years of collapse, and it's a lie in itself. Before he stepped down, Pope Benedict, whom I loved, said that there was, quote, a true council and a false council of the media, one that was cultivated by insiders with the help of the mass media. One could dismiss this as some kind of shoddy Nixonian populism. But for one fact, in the 1960s, it was Father Ratzinger himself who was one of the main players cultivating Weigel and all these other media figures in the United States. If there was a council of the media, Pope Benedict was one of the main players in it. So to recover its lost moral authority, the Church needs what many of us pray for, many holy priests. But so long as the Church remains stuck in its mode of managerialism, with an uncertain philosophy and theology, holy priests will be exceedingly difficult to develop or cultivate or recruit. we need these holy priests because otherwise, I agree actually with what was said before. The church could face a catastrophe along the lines of the Reformation itself: mass rupture, apostasy. Now, on the world stage, the Catholic Church faces many challenges. Islam is one, of course. Nationalism of the form China expresses constitutes another, urgent one, perhaps not to us here. Capital L liberalism, which I would distinguish from the everyday political usage of liberal, presents a very subtle challenge for the church because liberalism, for reasons of administrative efficiency, reduces all people and peoples into interchangeable individuals with the same interests, the same desires, and it tolerates religion only insofar as it remains a kind of private hobby and stays out of the way. This is, I think, I would relate it to the concept you articulated of empire. So a continued tension and conflict with liberal states in the West is inevitable, just as the divine right of kings and the rise of nationalism led to testing, turmoil, and division for the church. If I was giving advice, of course, my remedy would be to put off any policy changes, to put off any collegial discussion. I would not trust the bishops in a collegial manner to pick a mousetrap for their parishes, let alone set some kind of new or revolutionary course for the church. I would say to Pope Francis to come to a rescue of Catholics wandering in a desert for the past 50 years. Rid yourself, finally, of this ghost of modernism which reinterprets the gospel as man's longing for God, which says that Christ does not save us, but announces that we were already so worthwhile that we simply have to realize we were already saved. I mean, the truth is the Catholic Church needs Catholic Christianity, the original reform of Jesus Christ, who transformed man's search for God into what it was in the Garden of Eden. God's search for man, God calling out in the garden to Adam, "Where are you?" Where instead of man offering sacrifices as some kind of existential expression of himself to God, God expresses himself and his divine love through his own sacrifice, the sacrifice of the Mass. That is the reform the church needs. It needs holy men and women. In previous ages, some of those holy men and women, St. Catherine of Siena, had the courage to stand up and speak directly to the popes in Rome. They made themselves kind of a spectacle, a raw spectacle. We need that kind of faithfulness and holiness in the church. The other scandals, they may remain with us. I mean, there's no cure-all or policy measure that will suddenly restrain an evil priest from abusing a child. The rules, in a sense, were made to be broken by evil men. So what we need are good men. To have good men, they have to have a calling worth fighting for, worth giving up, something more than being a religious functionary. Why would you be a religious functionary when you can accumulate wealth or prestige or power in the world? The only thing that allows someone like a St. Thomas Aquinas to give up that pursuit is to pursue something greater, holiness. That's what the church needs today. Thank you.
Well, thank all of you. No one could accuse the three of you of all saying the same thing, that's for sure.
It's true.
All right, so this is totally unlike me, but I'm going to kind of play the adversary here. The Roman Catholic Church is the second largest religious body in the world. It has, I'm terrible with figures, but I believe it has 1.2 billion members. Surely there is something to be said about it that's positive. What?
The Catholic Church has a tremendous historical, spiritual, and theological patrimony, which it is now wagering like a hedge fund, wagering every mortgage on the planet. So yes, 1.2 billion members it announces this week. How many disciples followed Jesus up in John 6 in the fields until he said, "Eat my flesh, drink my blood." How many of them were at the cross at Calvary? John, Mary, no other apostles. So in a time of testing, people run away, and there seem to be no shepherds. I mean, the church is left rudderless, and in fact now it's even saintless in a sense. We make up these fake saints like John Paul II because we have no one like Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa could speak at Harvard and challenge that audience to the gospel, to love one another, to not use each other to not use people as instruments for our own ambition. She's gone. The church needs more like her. So.
You shook your head?
No, I'm not shaking my head.
No, I meant you agreed. Yes.
So, about the fake holiness of the Saint Popes, I wonder what you would make of Julius II, a semi-animal, who was a Pope warrior. So I think that we, in these last 50 years, this is my view, we have seen the Catholic Church trying to become a world church. So until Vatican II, Catholicism was a European-centered kind of thing. Now it is a world church, and what happened with Vatican II and with what happened after Vatican II in these 50 years, Catholicism has become the single religion or church that is in every continent, in every country, and it is a moral presence in every corner of the world. When a war starts, the diplomats most of the times flee, the NGOs flee, bishops and missionaries stay. This is a witness. So we can blame Vatican II for many things, especially if we don't have an historical view of things. But what we have to be honest about is that with Vatican II, the Catholic Church took seriously its universal call in making itself a sacrament in terms of a symbol in a very powerful meaning of this word sacrament, a sacrament of the unity of humankind. This is why we have people despising popes now, because they have become symbols of the unity of humankind. And if you are attached to a sectarian view of Catholicism, we are going to despise those popes. So on the positive side, I think that Catholicism for non-Catholics and for non-believers has become more about what's out of Catholicism than a lobby for itself. In my career, I've studied Vatican diplomacy in these last 40 years. So they have done beyond the Iron Curtain in Russia, in Poland, in Eastern Germany. They have done things that all for the benefit of the democracies in those countries that went beyond the petty interest of Catholicism there. And that is possible because Vatican II took seriously that being a Christian is not about feeding your aesthetics, your moral certainty, your righteousness, but it is about serving. And so I think that in the institution, in the Catholic Church as an institution, I think that there's much to be said for what it has done in these last 50 years, which is different from, if we compare these last 50 years with what happened in World War II. It's easy to make a judgment on this difference. So there are many things that I think can and must be said about what is still good, and I think that it's even more visible as time goes by what is good on that side. I'm very convinced of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what's good? Um, don't take this as an offense, everyone, but the church won't look like everybody in this room. And I think that's probably what's good. Where it's growing, it doesn't look like most of us in this room. So that's the first thing. I think that's really important because that shift is going to mean a different kind of thing. So that's the first thing. I actually think, though, in a kind of a perverse way, that the bad is good. And the bad, which is all of these things coming out, has lifted, two very big things out of the church. One is canon law does not stand apart from law, period. The law of the land, the law of wherever you are, okay? Because you could pretend in a vacuum that the church could do whatever it wants and that canon law supersedes everything. But I think that this whole fiasco about the sexual abuse scandals have made this very apparent that whatever the church is, it has to exist in the world whether it likes it or not. It doesn't matter what happened with Vatican II. It doesn't matter about any of that stuff. Churches live in cities where there are DAs and stuff happens and they cannot run away from it. And so they are forced, whether they want to change the rules or not, they are forced to have to deal with the law. And I think that is an amazing thing because that changes everything. Beforehand, you can run this stuff in the shadows, and now it's out in the open. So that is a very good thing. I actually think that the other good thing that is happening is that a sense in which, for the people who stay, that they claim more of the church for themselves. See, I don't think it's about the main line. I'll just be blunt with you. This is not a fight because the main line is dead. That's not even a fair comparison.
Mainline Protestantism.
Yeah, in Protestantism. I mean, the real issue is how do you have the same kind of moral setup in Pentecostalism and neo-charismatics who are saying we don't want to have homosexuals, we don't want women, we don't want women sometimes, we don't want, sex before marriage. You're saying the exact same moral issues that the church has been talking about, but they're getting the people. And so it is causing the church to have to confront the fact that they can't say, we're the only game in town anymore. Because they are not. Now they have to deal with everybody else. And if we talk about that number that you quoted, think about this. Most people don't realize this. Once you have a baptismal certificate and you decide you want to walk away from church, where do you go? You don't go off and write to somebody and say, I don't want to be a Catholic anymore. Thanks so much. You just go down the street and you go up to the altar and you receive Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior at the local Assemblies of God or whatever it is, right? So the Catholic Church is still counting these numbers. I think that number is conflated by like a few 100 million or something. Lop off that, and then maybe that's the number we ought to start with. Because I'm not even sure that's the number. So the good thing is that maybe with all of these things, is that they will be forced to have to deal in the world. It's not about modernity, really. It's just about, oh my gosh, you have a church that's, whether it's in the middle of Philadelphia or it's in the middle of Lagos, Nigeria, or wherever, there is a world around that church that has to be dealt with, encyclicals or not. Doesn't matter. And they've got to deal with the things that are happening on the ground in everyday people's lives. And that is the challenge for the church, is can it deal in these very far-flung places in a globalized world where the news gets out on the internet in 2 seconds flat, where a prime minister from Ireland could take on, the church in a viral video, and they get so upset that they just pull their, ambassador away and say, oh, we can't deal with this, but they can't get the news out. This problem is forcing the church to have to deal with itself in a profoundly different way. And so if we come out on the other side of this, maybe in 50 years, it'll be great. It's probably going to be smaller, but it'll be a good thing. If not, then it's all going to fall apart and it'll split up anyway.
What questions do you have for one another?
Well, actually, I want to start with Brenda because I was thinking our comments, although they were coming from very different sides of the track, almost mirrored the same things. We're not, you weren't happy about it. I kind of left at the beginning when you were talking about Vatican II because I see Vatican II obviously very differently. But I was interested in what you said about, the bishops losing their moral authority and all of this. And you would see that obviously from a very different place that I am. What would you think that they ought to do, at least for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops?
What should they? In all honesty, I mean, I don't know why this happened. Perhaps because of the fact of pluralism in the world.
Yeah.
Catholic laity have often, I think, been way too deferent to bishops.
Yeah.
Because again, and I see this in this adaptation of the faith, or this distortion of the faith, as a political ideology. And so they don't criticize their bishops. I mean, what should happen? 50, 100 bishops should resign in sackcloth and ashes.
Yeah.
Others should not just deal with
Yeah.
protests and angry letters, but be put in stockades and rotten fruit thrown at them. I mean, this is what Catholics have done in history to their bishops when they fail. And it's quite serious. I mean, I will stand for the spiritual authority of the papacy and of the episcopacy to my dying breath. But I will never stand up and say that bishops are good. I mean, we need to recover the Catholic imagination of St. John Chrysostom or Dante that sees hell as paved with the skulls of bishops. That in itself is essential for Catholic life, is just an awareness of sin, that Christ was abandoned by all his apostles but one at the cross. So the bishops
Although there were a
themselves...
bunch of women.
Right. But so the bishops themselves, we need to respect them less, or respect them in the right way.
If I may.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm not a bishop. I'm married, so. But I really feel for the bishops because they have only enemies. I mean, they are despised by both sides. They are hated by both sides. So we may like or not what the bishops stand for, what they say, how they look like, their language, and I'm not famous for being an advocate of their message. But after all, this is Catholicism. And in the Catholic ecclesiology, the episcopacy is the line that gets us in connection with Peter. And so it is much more complicated to get rid of the episcopacy or of the whole episcopal class, if you want, at one time. It's called schism. I mean, you can do that, but it's not Catholicism anymore.
Right.
It's not.
You're not proposing that.
There's one particular that the Pope is Pope because he's a bishop and is a bishop of Rome. So if we want to get rid of all the bishops, we should get rid also of the Pope, dear leader, as you called him. So this is way beyond the boundaries of being critical of. So I think that being a bishop now is a terrible job. It is incredibly more complicated than ever because he has to be a CEO, a human resources, a spokesperson, unless they hire Sarah Palin's former expert, let's say. So it is an incredibly difficult job. But I reject this idea that Catholicism would be better off without bishops. Because this is just like, and coming out from my mouth, it shocks me, but this is just like thinking that putting on death row all the representatives in Washington will improve the situation. I'm not convinced. I come from Italy. I still have a lot of contacts with them. And when the political elite was running Italy, things were bad. Now the people is running the place, and it's much worse. I can assure you, it's much worse. And this is what's happening in Catholicism. So bishops, for me, they get a lot of things wrong in terms of content, in terms of style, in terms of... But in in the history of the Catholic Church, the most important teachings about Catholic faith, they have always come out of things called councils, where bishops are the ones with the right to vote. One bishop, one vote. It's a very democratic thing. Bishop of New York counts one, bishop of my hometown, 300,000 people, count one. So if we want to reject this because we think that they are liberal or we think they are conservative, we can do that. But let's not say that it's still Catholicism after all, because it would be something that is beyond the boundaries of what the Catholic Church is. All that said, I think that bishops, and this is a fact, this is not opinion, this is fact, bishops are now the most criticized individuals in the world, probably, in the world. So they face fire from every side, culturally, ideologically, legally, humiliated regularly by Rome. I mean, it's you have only enemies. So I think that then executing every bishop or executing every representative or every senator would satisfy our thirst for blood, satisfaction, revenge, but I think it would make things worse.
Right, and
We weren't really saying.
I don't want to propose a populist church, but the distance between bishops and the rest of the church, though, is too great in many cases. I remember when
Sometimes that's good.
no, sometimes that's fine. I mean, I listen. Right, for the American Conservative, I'm the most reactionary guy in this city at the moment. I'm no friend of democracy in the church, as a kind of modern statement. But the complete lack of accountability is shocking. I mean, we can't excuse bad governance by just saying we need governance. So let's put up with it being bad. I mean, what I want to address is the problem. I mean, Cardinal Egan was, how do I put this? Evil, period. To not recognize that, to not call him a Judas, is a betrayal. Now, I will not say he's not the bishop, or that if he decides to move one priest to one parish, that he should just be openly disobeyed. That's a completely separate matter. I mean, it's the situation Jesus described. These men sit on the throne of Moses, do as they say, but do not do as they do. I mean, that to me is the Catholic attitude.
See, and I think that the laity have served as enablers of a lot of trouble in the Catholic Church. Like I heard, apropos of sex abuse, a story one time where several children in a family had been abused by a local priest, and the priest had come every night to their house and put their 5 children to bed for months. And I thought, excuse me, these people are lunatics. I mean, who would have the local priest come and put their kids to bed every night? It's like, my parents weren't the brightest bulb in the bunch, but they would not have had the local priest putting us to bed every night. It just, or I was on a finance committee at Xavier on 15th Street. This is not a conservative parish, let me tell you, and this was in the 80s, but when the priest would come in, all these ostensibly liberal Catholics would turn their chair in his direction. And I don't even think they knew they were doing it, do you know? So that there were practices inculcated us, I think, as immigrants, that I don't think have served us well. So I'm inclined to agree with you that there needs to be more talking back out of respect, as a matter of
but
fact.
I mean, it's also, it's a theological thing, too. And I think this is the biggest thing is, like, this is Christ representative on earth. This piece that I talked about, I wanted to just sort of recommend this. It's practicalmattersjournal.org. And it's Doing Religious Studies with Your Whole Body by Robert Orsi. It's really great, but it talks about this whole Catholic thing. And one of the stories he tells is that, the housekeeper of the rectory opened up the door every day right after school so that and led this kid up to the bedroom that had gotten molested, right? But it's that whole thing.
Yeah.
And if you think that this is Christ representative on earth and they can't possibly do anything wrong, then there's no question, right?
Yes, but-
And you don't question that person can be bad. Now, that's the theological piece. I mean, the actual priest is that you should question this person, even though that they're doing something else. But the fact that we're not has made us all go over the cliff in a certain way. I mean, I'm laughing because I just think, Michael, that I was the one who was going to throw the flamethrower in the room.
Yeah,
You've thrown the flamethrower and enabled me, so thank you. But I think that's the problem, and this is where the problem becomes with this culpability of everyone in being subservient in a certain kind of way. We've raised a church of people who are willing to be abused. And that's the whole point, is that you want this thing to happen so that you can get your salvation or whatever. And now we have all become a part of the cycle of abuse in a certain kind of way.
Do people really learn? I wonder if they learn that in church. I mean, because I was barely taught anything in going to Catholic school or being catechized.
You post Vatican II?
Yeah, I mean, I was barely taught anything, let alone, the conditions of America, the conditions of a market economy are what are more likely to incline me to allow myself to be used or abused by someone more powerful than me than anything I learned in the church.
I think it was also part of the deference, though, in the church. I'm thinking about my own family. I mean, on my mother's side, it's fifth generation Black Catholics, folks. How do you become a Black Catholic in Louisiana? You get, you come into the port of New Orleans, and in 7 days, you got to get, the Code Noir says we got to baptize them, and you sell them. And then that's it, right? So that's how my family is of being Catholic. But I remember the story of my grandmother. The first SVD Black priest came to St. Martinville, Louisiana, and there he was every Sunday having dinner at the house, and there was a huge amount of deference played to him, and in some bad ways. But I think it's not just about learning it from outside. I just think it's an attitude about what happens inside of the church, and part of that has to do with the theological stance pre-Vatican II or post-Vatican II. The other thing that I don't talk about a lot, but I think somebody really needs to think about and write about, whether we're talking about seminaries or convents, how people come in, and the generations of people who have come in and have been systemically raped.
Yeah.
Because this has happened. I mean, most of us in this room don't realize you have to be really old or a historian to know this. But, the average age that you used to go into seminary as a boy was 12 years old. Okay? This is right at puberty. So if you have this happening, you have a place where nobody talks about this, and this is happening in the 1920s and 30s, you've got this whole cycle. Look at the rule of St. Benedict. We don't want older men sleeping in bed with younger ones. It's in the rule. This is from 500. So, I mean, this has already been something that has happened. So where the church won't deal with sexuality or gender, all those things, I don't necessarily need them to modernize themselves. And I want to put that on the table. It's like, that's not my project in a way, because I know what the church is. I know what it is as a historian. I don't need them to modernize, but I need them to recognize that's something different. And if they're not going to change, then that's fine. But they need to also address the fact that these issues of sexuality have put the church in this bind, and it's put it in the financial bind that it's in right now. Who would have ever thought that sex would have been the thing that was going to sink the church, money-wise?
It is amazing in a sense. We were talking about, I think, addressing that the church. Massimo, you're saying in America there's this kind of fetishizing of the family, and part of it, I think, comes from the immigrant heritage of the Catholic Church in this country. I mean, the church grew literally through the procreation of Irish, Italians, Polish, etc., far more than anything else. I mean, and it's left us with a church that has family secrets. I mean, like the weird uncle you won't talk about, or chatty Kathy who never comes out of her house. And it's left the church, at least in America, in this position where it's completely, it's extraordinarily difficult to become a Catholic if you're not one, in a way that it isn't for an evangelical or a Pentecostal. You can go to a Catholic church, you can go to Catholic Mass for years, and no one will ever say hello to you.
That's true.
I mean, just think about this. You could not go to an AA meeting and be this anonymous.
So true.
No, sometimes,
So true.
sometimes
So sad.
sometimes anonymity is good. You know, I think it's good that churches are built often with pillars so that the prodigal son can kind of duck into mass, reconcile himself to God quietly without becoming a huge spectacle. But the church has almost no sense of mission beyond the home in the United States. I don't know if it's nearly so bad elsewhere, but this is like a shocking scandal. I mean, it's not going out into the world; it's just closing in on ourselves. And the thing is too, I think we're addressing each other sometimes sideways. You know, the church's diplomats have been heroic, as you've said, and have gone beyond the mere interest of the church. But it is not selfish to, in fact, I think it's quite opposite of selfish for the church, for Catholic Christianity to respond to and feed its members with truth, beauty, and goodness. I mean, I do not think a strip the altars style of liturgical engagement is generous with the poor. I mean, if anything, we should be sharing our heritage more generously with the poor. You know, instead of having a specialized kind of high church for a few rich parishes like my own in Fairfield County, Connecticut, where, you know, they do all the high mass. It's beautiful, it's glorious, it feeds the soul. I mean, people want truth, they want beauty, they want goodness. They want some sense that the church is something different than a super NGO or, you know, the Elks Lodge. But that heritage should be shared more widely, I think. It should be given out almost recklessly. You know, have the Pope send the Vatican choir to, you know, the dirty streets of Managua to sing Monteverdi and Palestrina. That's an act of generosity, I think.
That's interesting, because one of the lowest point of Pope Benedict's pontificate last year, it was on the Mass for the Feast of St. Peter and Paul, June the 29th. And I was not there, but I was at the reception for the 4th of July at the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See in Rome. And so I was told this by several people. In this Mass, which is one of the high solemnity, the choir performed the Mass, Papa Marcelli, which is a strange kind of Mass because the people in the pew that don't get to say amen, not even once. This is the pre-Vatican II idea of liturgy. Mm-hmm. You have one crazy guy doing things that you don't understand because it's Latin, it's ecclesiastical Latin, so it's not even Cicero. And he performs gestures that are extremely complicated to perform, and everybody else do their thing.
Say the rosary.
So, if we want this kind of Catholicism, just let's say we have exchanged beauty for Baroque. They both begin with B, but it's different. So, I think that the liturgical reform was a good thing because it said that being Catholic, you don't need to go under the yoke of European Baroque culture. And I'm astonished that I see so much resistance to the liturgical reform coming from Americans, and I say even my students here that know nothing about Latin. I mean, it's if I would take them to a Catholic Mass in Arabic, I don't think that they would notice the difference. So the idea of the poverty of the Second Vatican Council was not material destitution. It was the idea that the highest riches that the Catholic Church has is the gospel and not Baroque architecture. That is theologically, anthropologically a very important message. So I'm Italian and I live in the Midwest, so I don't need to tell you how much I miss Baroque, the real one. I mean Sicilian Baroque, Southern German Baroque. So I'm very European. I'm very Italian. I miss that. But I don't think that it is necessary to be a Catholic. That's the whole point.
Okay.
Questions, 'cause
I want to ask a question. Should we stop?
No, I'm just saying that I was going to go.
Yeah,
so
we're gonna go, and if
wanted to
anybody
bring
wanted to
it
have
up.
questions.
Yeah,
with me,
anybody has a
yeah,
question for Anthony?
Yeah.
Yes.
we should probably do that now.
Oh, pardon. This is the first crisis that you mentioned, this absolute hierarchy, and this the Vatican still puts this out on its website. It has its own territory. It's the last remaining absolute monarchy in Europe. To what extent, then, in dealing with this crisis, say from a more traditionalist perspective, is any sort of reform or a greater recovery of holiness possible in this 17th century political form in the 21st century? I'm thinking that might touch upon some of the critiques put forward by the Protestant theologian Stanley Hauerwas of Constantinism, this locked-in sort of imperial notion built into the church. How much of that rooted in the political form of being an absolute monarchy? And perhaps for Anthea, the flip side of that would be how much progressive or liberal reform is therefore possible within that structure, aside from schism? Thank you.
I'll go first. Not much. I mean, I'll start off by saying this. One of the reasons why I think Benedict is back in Vatican City is because he doesn't want to get arrested. Okay? And that is a very profound statement that I just made there. Think about it. You're hiding in a territory. And, I mean, he could have gone back to Bavaria. I would have gone back to Bavaria. I would have wanted to die in Germany. But he's behind the walls. Okay? So that's already a problem. How does it happen in a liberalizing way? I mean, honestly, I continue to go back to the law. I mean, then that's not even liberal. It's just the law. Whether that's the EU comes against them or some other things that happen here in the States, that's going to clean it out. It doesn't touch the monarchical part of this. But I think one thing that's interesting to me is that Francis, when he took office, kept saying, "I'm the Bishop of Rome. I am the Bishop of Rome. I am the Bishop of Rome." And I thought that was a nice little allusion to what might be the way he's going to try to deal with this in his administration, is to try to take a little bit of edge off of the monarchical. The other piece I think that's really interesting with that is that notice that the Eastern Rite folks have been there, and all the rest of these folks have been around. And I'm just very fascinated to see what's going to happen with the Orthodox and all of this, because I just wonder if there's this rapprochement that is going to occur, in part because they know they are in so much trouble, that I don't think we can bring the East and West completely back together, but I think this might be a way to try to shore up some of the holes that are happening within the Catholic Church. So while that's not a liberal kind of way to think about it, I think in a way it's the only way you can. I don't think that all of the parties that want, honestly, I don't care if women become priests. I don't personally want to be one. I don't think all the people who want women priests or gays or everything else, I don't think they're going to get anything that they want in the next 50 to 100 years in the church. But what I do think is that these external pressures on this monarchical system will break down, in part because of the internal frissions and fractures that have happened. And it's going to be from within to out that this thing can occur. So if there's any liberalizing, the liberalizing will come through the cracks of the internal structure breaking.
Just to respond as quickly as I can to what you're saying, the monarchical aspects of the papacy are a burden on being a pope. But I would say that the idea of kingship is not just inherited from the Age of Kings in Europe. It's very biblical. I mean, I'm actually reading a book on Job. Job is a kind of king of the East. The three comforters of Job are kings themselves. They're paterfamilias. They're patriarchs.
Yes.
And the lesson of the book of Job, in a sense, is that he became more a king after the boils, the trials, the death of his entire family, stripping away of all the worldly aspects of his power. That is when he began to really rule in maturity, rule himself, rule his land, rule his people. And I think, as Massimo said, there's a kind of providence to this ongoing crisis or catastrophe in the Catholic Church. And, perhaps future popes will be crowned with thorns instead of mitres, and that would be, not that I desire our future oppression, but that would bring great grace to the Church. So we await for it.
Okay, Massimo.
You said that the Catholic Church is absolutely monarchical, and this one thing that it is much more complicated than that. So it seems very monarchical, but in the first millennium it was much less vertical than it is today. The second millennium, with this, Vatican II, with Vatican I putting the papacy on steroids, basically, it's the highest point of this. With Vatican II, we have a rediscussion of the structure in a more collegial way. You might say, and that's fair, that actually the Pope can act unilaterally, and that's true. There's one difference, though, that the Pope, to impose his will or his teaching, cannot send out tanks. And this is one of the things that happened with Pope Benedict. There were signals coming about the liturgical reform, about Vatican II, and my impression is that the body of the Church rejected them. It was like a transplant of an organ that has been rejected by the body of the Catholic Church. And this is called, in theology, reception. If things work, usually there's a fair amount of reception of these teachings, of these examples, and there's always a fringe or group that doesn't accept that. But when the rejection is massive, as it happened with Pope Benedict, that shows us that the monarchical structure or the papacy as a monarchical institution is much more fragile. It needs consensus. It needs also consensus. So it's not based on elections, on polls, but there's an element of that. So we should not think of Catholicism as a kind of North Korea, where you can use force. It doesn't work this way, and that's one of the magics of Catholicism, I think.
I have kind of more a question for Michael. I'm probably more familiar with the situation in Ireland because I go there about 4 or 5 times a year, and I'm not talking about academics. I'm talking about the people, and there's fury there still, and you have to take into consideration, that Catholicism is very much tied in with the old state in Ireland, so it's a little bit of an aberration. But I do have some issues with you sort of blaming everything on Vatican II, but it's like this. But this idea that it's sort of a revolution that kind of came up full blast out of nothing, and it was addressing a decline that was already taking effect. And to say that, well, see, everything's kind of crumbling, it was already crumbling. And also, I think, in terms of the absolute monarchy, conciliarism and other movements in the past have checked that absolute monarchy. But I think the word where none of us, I haven't heard yet, is the whole idea of infallibility and the idea of the Pope being infallible. And coming back, I think that's a lot of what I hear in Ireland, is that, that so much power has accrued to him through that ideology. So dear leaderism, I think, comes from the infallibility idea rather than Vatican II.
Well, it can. I mean, where I see the dear leaderism coming from is just the distortion or the reduction of the faith to a political ideology that people adopt. And it's kind of a complicated notion to get at. I do not think that the pre-Vatican II period was some great age for the Church. I mean, conservatives, liberals, and traditionalists in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s were often all speaking the same language. They were often speaking this language of this problem of, quote, modern man, that the Vatican was not able to address or was totally unresponsive to. And I think I agree with Massimo that the church pre-Vatican II was so intimately connected with power, with civil authority, with familial authority, with in Ireland. My father lives in Ireland. I'm actually headed there tomorrow too. I mean, priests would just walk into a house and say, "Okay, this daughter, she has to go somewhere. There's a problem. There's trouble," and people just were docile to this. I don't know if that comes from papal infallibility, which is technically a very restricted
Indeed.
doctrine,
Indeed.
right? I mean, this has supposedly been only exercised twice since the doctrine was even announced.
Yeah, but that's irrelevant to the
Well-
fact that it's there. That just because it was exercised twice, it's still a steroidal.
Well, it certainly gives the impression, and popularly, people. This is why I retch as a traditionalist. I think I retch at the popular piety around the papacy. I think of it as papalatry. It is this exaggeration of the intimacy of the Pope with the people of the Church. So I would love to see that reduced. I would love to see Catholic intellectuals and lay apologists beat their own course rather than, slavishly wait and announce the newest encyclical. I mean, this, my blame on Vatican II, I think, is a little bit. Well,
Please go ahead.
I think that the Church was left after Vatican II with all of the authority it had accrued pre-Vatican II, and but with a totally uncertain mandate. I mean, I think you had this revolutionary theology of modernism, which was sophisticated and beautiful in its way. I mean, Karl Rahner is gorgeous to read in the English, in the German that he wrote in. It's actually almost impenetrable. But that had no significant errors. And I think what you have afterwards is nothing but authority. Martin Mosebach, a more circumspect German intellectual, calls it the heresy of formlessness. There was nothing left but the authority of the bishops, the popes. Authority to do what? For what reason? I think that's been lost.
It is true that Vatican II it promised much more than it could keep. There's no doubt about that. So there's, in terms of expectations, in terms of trust and of confidence on what bishops could accomplish, you're right. So I understand it. I don't understand when we see Vatican II as elevating the doctrines of modernism. So if we look at modernism, after all, we see historical criticism of a text, of the biblical text. I think this is a blessed modernism. I mean, this has been a great safeguard against fundamentalism and so on. So I'm not saying that the post-Vatican II period was without problems. Not at all. There have been many problems, but after every council, I mean, one of the symbols of the Council of Trent is the institution of the seminary for the formation of priests. So if research tells us that in the average diocese in the Western world, we had the first seminary, built with students in there after 70, 80, 90 years. So we are 50 years after. So I think that Vatican II is like Trent in a way. And from the institutional point of view, from the symbolic, cultural, there are things that are still being worked out. But I think that the theology there is not what, and I wrote that down, the heresy of Gallicanism, the ghost of modernism. So I think that Vatican II made a great synthesis of the Catholic tradition with capital T. And Vatican II, when it talks about episcopal conferences and so on, It rejects explicitly Gallicanism. Explicitly. The Synod of Pistoia 1786 is the bad example. We are not doing this. We're doing something else. The modernism, in the document on the Bible, there is Bible and the tradition, and that's why Karl Barth went furious, because he said, well, they're still Catholics. Of course, they're still Catholics. So I buy this argument that there has been a period of chaos, absolutely. But I think that the theological content of the Second Vatican Council is the best possible synthesis of 20th century Catholicism, looking back of what went wrong in the 19th century, early 20th century. So I have a very, I am very comfortable with the theology of the Second Vatican Council for what it could talk about. For what it couldn't talk about, women and homosexuality, we cannot blame Vatican II. I mean, it was 50 years ago. I think that we tend to blame Vatican II if we think that before Vatican II we had a few incidents with democracy, with human rights, with freedom, but the whole thing was healthy. I was born in 1970, so I cannot witness what was Vatican II in the 1950s. But in Italy, which was already a constitutional democracy, in the 1950s, Protestants sometimes ended up in jail for being Protestant because the Catholic Church was opposed to religious freedom, and the Italian constitution was saying, well, sure, we are going to obey the Catholic doctrine. So this was Italy, was not Mars. It was a few steps from Rome. I think that there's a very big risk of idealize what was before. Yeah, that's as a historian, that's my problem.
And I don't want to idolize what's before. I mean, I go to a church with the pre-Vatican II liturgy, with the Palestrino and Monteverdi. The whole congregation is able to sing the Creed in Latin, both Creed 1, setting 3, the fourth Gregorian setting. So there's no lack of participation. My problem with the council is not every single word of every document. Some of it is beautiful. Some documents like Gaudium et Spes, I think, are frankly embarrassing and will end up like the Council of Vienne, just a piece, the Council of Vienne ranted and raved about the Knights Templar for political reasons. And I think Gaudium et Spes in a document like that will be just as forgotten by history eventually as Vienne was. But the council fossilizes debates that were at the council. So you have documents that say what X, and then they say not X in the next line. And they wait for the debate to play out afterward. So I don't know. I'm skeptical of discovering the true meaning of the council. I mean, after Trent, you could say, if anyone says he is saved by faith alone, apart from grace, or apart from true works of charity and the work of regeneration, he's cursed. After Vatican II, you can say anything.
Well, with condemnations, it's
Okay,
very easy
fellas,
to
listen.
say you're out.
Whoa. Okay, we're going to take a break, and we will continue after the break.
Okay.